It doesn't say that in this verse at all. It doesn't say that you have a break in between the end of the portion of Jethro. There's a break in the Torah scroll, and then we go straight into this, and these are the statutes and the rules and regulations that you put before them. And the before them is before. One of the meanings is, the simple meaning is before the people, the children of Israel. But another meaning is you should put before them is that you should put your disputes before them. You should put your disputes before a Jewish court of halachic law. You shouldn't go to a Gentile court with your disputes. And the discussion is, even if you know that their decision happens to be, their rulings happen to be the same when it comes to this particular matter, you still should not go to a Gentile or a court of an idolatrous court of the Canaanites, the Rashi says. And I don't think it's literally Canaanites, but he means to say a court of the society of the pagan culture that you may live amongst, or maybe your neighbors. You shouldn't go to their courts. And going to their courts is a desecration of God's name. You have the ability to go to a court of Torah law, and instead you go to a court, an idolatrous court, a pagan court, even though you know even though they have the same ruling, it's an insult. Obviously, the implication is also that you don't prefer to go to a court of Jewish law. Instead, you prefer to go to them. Why would you do that? It's insulting. It implies that there's something better there. Of course, there may be reasons for that. They may be able to enforce it better, but still, it's insulting and shouldn't be done. And this was the case for Jewish history until very recently. Interestingly enough, when Jews were kept separate in Europe, they were permitted during many different periods to have their own courts and to enforce their own law, not capital punishment, but civil law. They were able to adjudicate themselves. Anyway, but it seems like we're come back to a lot of the same topics, which is here has to do with the seventh law of Noahide law, is that we have to have courts. And so we come back to that right away, that we have to have courts, we have to respect halachic courts, we have to visit halachic courts and not go to other courts. So in other words, Noahide practice and Jewish practice, it's not just a religion, something that has to do with personal enlightenment and spirituality, but it's very practical in terms of our daily lives on a daily basis, even in money matters. We shouldn't feel that those provinces belong to some other area of our life, and they have nothing to do with the synagogue. It has to do with how I run my business. When it comes to that, I'm going to my local county court, which is really, in reality, that is the way we function today. So I'm talking about really, it shouldn't be that way. Really, all the different, we should really go to halachic court. I think if you look through this portion in which we just begin to discuss immediately after this first verse, which is discussing about just generally going to Jewish courts, we get into the specifics of purchasing a Hebrew slave, how Hebrew slaves are be treated, at what point is he freed, at what point a female maidservant is freed, the Hebrew maidservant, and etc., the laws of murder. We go through so many different things here in this week's reading. And it's all the nitty-gritty of life. Human interactions with each other, money matters, slaves. Slaves I mean, it's interesting because there's a lot of apologetics about this, of why the Torah discusses slaves. And those who want to say, well, it was a compromise made for that time period in which people had slaves. So it's just telling you, if you have a slave, this is how you deal with, this is how you behave towards a slave. Okay, maybe. Animals, let's say a person has an animal that causes harm, that, hey, wait, this has to do with you, Nancy. Nancy, this is your topic. Let's say there's a bull, you got a mad bull or a mad cow that, an angry cow that kicks somebody or gores somebody. This is a serious topic. This is not a joke. This can happen. It maybe happens more than we want to believe. I mean, so what happens? Causes someone damage, causes another animal damage. What kind of compensation is supposed to take place? And we talk about initially only half the damages, and then if the person knows that it's a dangerous animal, full damages have to be paid. Anyway, there's a lot of things here. We get to some of the details soon, but I wanted to really bring out an overarching point and theme, which I think has a lot to do with our divine mission in general, everybody. And that is what I slightly hinted to a few moments ago. What is the lesson we can learn from going from the event on Mount Sinai last week and all the incredible wonders that occurred there and the divine revelations that occurred there? And then we discuss, the 10 Commandments, and 10 Commandments coming from, God's mouth. The first 2 commandments, I am the Lord your God, you should have no other gods. And then the rest of them, God assisted Moses, so they were received in this miraculous, wondrous, divine manner. And now we're getting into all these details about human relations and money, and we're counting pennies here. How much you have to pay for this, how much you have to pay for that. So we're going from this high point to this kind of like getting to just, going out our front door. A moment ago we went out, we were on this high mountain, high peak, just this divine enlightenment, and now we're kind of just getting on the subway going to work. We went from one extreme to the next here. So how do we, what's the message of that? Going from that, even at the end of last week's reading, we're discussing things related to the temple, the altar, and then the ramp going up to the altar. I mean, these are lofty things, even though we spoke about last week how those things relate to human interaction. But at the end of the day, the discussion is about the temple, right? We said last week that the ramp, we were careful about not doing something insulting and walking in a insulting way while going up the ramp, which teaches us that that's the way to behave to a ramp. Obviously, between people, how careful we have to be and how we behave. But something, it's interesting. Even that, though, you could otherwise say, well, when you're in the temple, you have to behave very nicely to people. It's like when you're in the synagogue, of course, you say thank you and please. But what about when you're in the marketplace? What about when you're involved in business? Are you still a gentleman, or are you a shark when it comes to how your pennies and your dollar bills? How do you behave then? And this is a day-to-day battle, I think, for most people, and also very hard. And also, is it functional? I mean, a person wants to succeed in business, wants to prosper. Don't you have to be very tough? Don't you have to be very aggressive in order to succeed? So human beings have a tendency to feel that niceties belong in the temple, in the synagogue, at home. But in the marketplace, that's totally different person. In the marketplace, you have to be You have to be a shark. You have to be a dog. I don't know how to call it. You have to be very tough. Well, anyway, my point of all this background is simply to say that the juxtaposition of these two worlds is that the Torah is seeking that we join these worlds. The Torah wants us, what God wants is that we recognize his kingship and his dominion over us. We recognize his existence, and we're, from, I could say in Hasidic parlance, we reveal godliness in the nitty-gritty of life. Another way of saying that might be, basically is that we recognize God's kingdom in the nitty-gritty of this physical world, this physical existence. We bring him into that. He's here, he's present. In other words, there should be no there's no double life. There's no two ways of living. And also when we're out in the world, we're also involved in a mission with God as well. We're doing things, hopefully, an upright Jew, an upright Ben Noah should also be doing things for the sake of heaven, even in the workplace. At the very least, they're thinking, how do I make sure to do things in a way that follows Jewish law? How do I make sure that I'm doing things that follows Noahide law? That I don't transgress in any way. I don't do anything that's dishonest, that may touch on something that's from taking what belongs to another person. That shouldn't cross that border, shouldn't be in all dishonest, should make sure to pay my workers on time, et cetera, et cetera. All the things that are discussed this week. And in fact, even if mistakes are made, what do I do? How do I respond when there's a dispute? What happens if one of my animals, my livestock, does cause damage? Of course, you could say in the first place I should maybe be careful that doesn't happen, but in the end of the day, it happens sometimes. In the portions that discuss the patriarchs, more than once, it was alluded to the fact that the flocks of the patriarchs were different than everyone else's, and that the patriarchs and also the 10 tribes were careful that their flocks should not go and feed in the fields of others, that they made sure that they grazed their flocks in the desert, in wild areas, not to touch upon the fields that belong to other people, and therefore not to commit theft. Heaven forbid. And so we see this lesson already there. But it continues this week in the discussion where actually someone makes a mistake, where the person's animals do go off into someone else's field. What do you do in a situation like that? Which is also interesting and important in that God is interested in even people who stumble and who are maybe more average or not as careful, and they've made mistakes, and how can they correct and remedy those mistakes that they've made? Because you could argue a person should be more careful. Why are your animals going into someone else's field in the first place? But God's interested in that also. Even there, we have to come back and consult the Torah in those situations as well. So that's one point I want to make, which is really, really fundamental, I think, to all of Torah and all of Noahide law in general, is that we're making a point that there's no place outside of God's dominion, and there's no person doesn't have two identities, one in the synagogue or a temple, one outside. The person should be a harmonious, unified person, the same person in all different. They shouldn't have different, and you find this very often with people. When they're with family, they act one way. When they're at work, they act another way. When they're in front of maybe in court, they may act a different way, especially in front of a judge. Oh, they're so nice then. So trust me, they're very, very polite when they're in front of people with a lot of power. And a judge has a lot of power. Maybe more power than elected officials, because most of the time they don't get elected very often. So, and when they're in front of you, they can mess you up. They can make a lot of problems. So you're very careful to be not polite to them.
Rabbi, could I ask a question here?
Yes, you may,
Oh, thank you.
Ms. Wells.
Uh, the idea of coming before the rabbis of Beit Din to settle a dispute rather than go to a Gentile court or something. Say, for example, Nancy and I, we're non-Jews, but we have taken on as much Torah as we can. We want to follow Torah, but we have a dispute. Can we bring that to the rabbis and let a rabbi, would they decide between us, even though we're not Jews, but we are Noahide? Would that be an option for us?
Yes, I think that it's definitely something that you could do. You might want to inquire previously about the court to make sure that they're familiar with, what we call psak, with adjudication, halachic decision making for Noahides. Probably would be a good idea. Yeah, there's no reason why you couldn't do that. There's a problem with the Jewish courts today from a practical standpoint. From theoretically speaking, there's absolutely nothing that should restrain you from seeking a judgment or ruling from a halachic rabbinical court. In practicality, in this case, let's say between you, Sandy, and Nancy, you probably could do it because it would probably be an it would probably be, done in a respectful way, and so on. But the problem is, in very heated disputes, the Beis Din doesn't have a lot of power. I think in conversion, obviously, they do have a lot of power, but the problem is that both parties have to agree to be fully honor the decision of the court. It doesn't have any teeth on its own. It can't. There's no police or anything or marshals that are going to enforce anything. So both parties have to really be serious about accepting and honoring what they have to say. And if they don't do that, the problem is that it can lead to more strife, because what could happen is then one of the people say, I don't like this decision, I want to go to another court, and it kind of becomes it could become, that's the difference is in a non, and this is a very sad problem. We're lacking the finality to a certain extent in Jewish courts, because if it's not enforced and you have one party that's stubborn, you can have a problem, because if they don't accept the ruling, then it becomes just becomes a piece of paper, and then it doesn't help you. And that's also part of the problem, meaning to say, our first statement that we said that that a Jew or a Hebrew or an Israelite should take his grievances to a Jewish halachic court. And if they don't, then it's an insult. It's a desecration of Hashem's name. I mean, I think we a little bit have that problem when the exile, just in general, is that the halachic courts, have lost some of their legitimacy, particularly in disputes. I mean, obviously, in terms of something being kosher or not kosher, in terms of weddings, in terms of conversions, everything is fine. But in other words, in ritual things, there's no problems. But in disputes between people, you can have issues, because how do I say, if you have one party that is the losing party, if the losing party fails to honor the decision, so the dispute isn't finished, and that's a big problem. So I kind of more than answered so basically my answer to your question is that theoretically speaking, of course it can be done, and if both people honor the court, then it should definitely be done. If you have one party that doesn't honor the court, then the right thing to do for a Jew is they have to get permission from the court to go to a secular court because of the difficulty of the situation. They get permission to go, particularly if it's the same ruling. Yeah, so that's how that is. So it's a real difficulty today, and I could say that part of the discussion we've been having is a real problem of the exile, meaning that we're living in a world in which exactly this point is that where it's binary. That's a very common word now, and I hope I'm using it correctly. But my point is that there's like the synagogue and then there's business, and many people do follow halacha in business as they should, but there's always this element of that we have to go to the Gentile courts to sort it out, and that's a shame. It's very unfortunate, and but again, it shows the weakness just in general of the Jewish people in exile, where they don't have, and that's something about, good about, how do I say, I was going to say about in the state of Israel, it's a bit better, but even there, it's also not fully applied. And obviously, not only that, but when the law is applied, you take it out of its theoretical nature, it's a whole different experience. In other words, we have to deal with real consequences of decisions then. And that may or may not make a difference to the court, but it might make a difference. You got me off topic now, but just quickly, one of the biggest issues that's been really hovering, that's been a cloud for a very long time, really, in halakhic courts, is the problem, what's called the aguna crisis or problem. Aguna means, a Jewish woman whose husband has refused to give her a get, has refused to give her a halakhic divorce. And this can happen for many reasons. It's interesting that rabbinically speaking, a woman can also hold her husband up from getting a divorce, because rabbinically, a woman has to agree to accept a divorce as well. But biblically speaking, she does not. So a man could divorce his wife, again, not with her, doesn't need her consent to divorce her. Rabbinically, as a protection for women, she does. There's another safeguard in that divorce, a woman has to be paid the ketubah, which is a significant sum of money. So that was also done in order to protect women's rights, that they shouldn't just be tossed out if their husband they lost favor with their husband. So it's something that could cost him quite a pretty penny if he does toss her, divorce her at his whim. And so it's not something that was done, it could be done lightly. So that's another reason why the rabbis enacted the ketubah. There's differences of it. I think there may be some opinion that some levels of ketubah is biblical, but generally it's understood it's rabbinic. So this has been a very serious problem for a long time, and there's been very different views in terms of how to tackle this problem, meaning to say that you have disputes. Sometimes it's just very nasty things where just a husband isn't doing. Sometimes there's a dispute in which, there's property and things, and there's an attitude that the secular courts are very pro-woman, and that the only card that the man has is that if he withholds the get, maybe he can use that as a negotiating point. But unfortunately, most of the more serious cases, it's just dealing with people that are vindictive, that they're just, sometimes it's men who have left the fold. They're not even religious anymore. There's something wrong up there but they just refuse to cooperate. They want to, obviously they're trying to hurt their ex-wife their wife for some reason, their family. They're very unhealthy people. So what do you do in this situation? And there's been, so the rabbinical, the main, I don't know how to call it, but the non-Haredi Orthodox, I guess you could say, have accepted certain prenuptial agreements that they've crafted and co-opted in weddings that can be said, and I don't understand them fully how they operate, but that can help this situation that would basically, I guess, say if the man refused to give a get, that the retroactively that the marriage would become null and void. If that, I could be wrong about that because that creates a lot of halachic problems in itself. Because what about the children born during the marriage? If it's nullified retroactively, so that means all the children were born out of wedlock. So that creates a lot of problems. To be honest, I'm not familiar enough with the workings of this prenuptial to tell you. A lot of Haredi courts feel that marriage needs to be taken extremely seriously, and they don't want to, or they don't believe halachically that it can be done, that any prenuptials really can take place, and that the court has to just find ways to enforce and literally force a husband to give a get when necessary. But they seem to believe that prenuptials harm the sanctity of marriage and the seriousness of marriage. Because if you feel like you have a back door, and that goes for both men and women, then that affects the seriousness of marriage itself. And the Haredi rabbinic community doesn't want that to happen. There may be other reasons too, halachic reasons that they believe that. And I think courts in the past in Eastern Europe also didn't want to do these prenuptials. So anyway, obviously this is an extremely sticky subject. But here's the thing, when the Jewish communities in earlier generations when rabbis had a lot more clout, and there was more of a unified front. I'll put it this way. When the Jewish people were persecuted, you were stuck with the Jewish community. If you were Jewish, you were stuck. You couldn't just disappear among the Gentiles. So you could be excommunicated by a court. And that would be very serious trouble, because basically you were doing business within the Jewish community. You were fraternizing within the Jewish community. So if you were excommunicated, no one could buy from you, no one could speak to you, you couldn't come into the synagogue. Basically, your life was finished. I mean, that was extremely serious punishment. And that was something that even, after the destruction of the temple and even in exile, courts were authorized to do. So So courts had power to coerce someone to give a get and to do a lot of other things, which they were able to have a lot more legitimacy. But nowadays, excommunication, I don't know if I mentioned the word, but if an excommunication by the court doesn't really have enough punch as it once did. Because if the person is rebelling and they mix in with the Gentiles, and he doesn't really care. That's number one. Number two, there's a lot of different rabbinical establishments, and not all of them honor what the other ones do. There's this, and you can go to synagogues even that the members don't respect what maybe a rabbinical court decided in another country. So it's very, very problematic. And this is a very sad, very, very sad state of affairs, really. If the Beis Din doesn't have that kind of clout that it needs to have in order to ensure that there's justice, then we have a very sad situation in which, the Torah is not getting the respect it deserves all around. And it's really one of the painful realities of the exile right now. So anyway, so your question, Sandy, ended up to be a very long discussion, but I'm sure it was interesting to those who haven't heard about these things before. Okay. So I wanted to draw upon, so my main theme again is this bridge and this point of how we bring God into everything, even the most practical areas of our life. And of course, that also means that has to be functional. And I think that's also one of the differences between Christianity and Judaism. Also, is that philosophically, Christianity, its idea of, and again, I'm not an expert, but the idea of love over the commandments is kind of the idea of the idyllic and utopian, or the fantasy over reality. And that the Torah here is giving options of how do we actually function in life, accept certain things about how the world actually functions, but yet do the right thing within way people really are and the way things actually happen. And I think there is a desire in human weakness really to believe in a fantasy, or believe in a utopia, in a world of where where only positive and pleasant emotions will exist in that place. And that's where God is. But in the dirty aspects of life, that's not really, the God isn't there, because otherwise it would be a beautiful place with butterflies and bunnies and everyone's smiling and it's all so beautiful. But in life with it's dirty and people are walking in the mud and working with cows and it doesn't smell very nice, and people are haggling, how much does this cow cost? That's not really a place that seems like God is in that place. And Judaism is saying, no, God is in that place too, but that's a lot harder to accept. That's a lot harder to digest. And it's something that seems to human beings as something that's contradictory, And it's similar to the idea that God is even in suffering, The human mind wants to believe that God is good. And so if suffering's happening, that must be a bad force. When good happens to me, that's God. When bad things happen, maybe that's something else. When bad things happen to bad people, that's God. So, but the Torah tells us, no, when bad things happen to good people, that's also God. And that's something very hard to accept, in which people can't wrap their heads around. And really, so again, the God of that's not the Jewish God, the non-Jewish God that, again, I don't want to point a finger, but I'm just saying that the mistake, I'll just say, of a lot of people and their understanding of God is that they're not leaping beyond their own ability to comprehend the world. They want to put God into their box, and basically say, well, God is good. And so what I see as good, that's where he is. It's other things that just can't be, So basically, in other words, they're dictating reality based on their own mind. What Judaism is basically, it's the humility to say, we just don't understand. We have to accept, and we don't understand it. Now, look, there may be some thinkers in other religions that also have. So this isn't really a critique, an overall critique. It's not my interest to go there. Just this one point that I wanted to bring out, something that I noticed as far as what things are emphasized. This idea of that's so well known about in Christianity, or Pauline Christianity, about this idea of that God has to do with love, and that the laws are something that's that's a negative thing. And I think that has to do with this idea that we want that God is like this pristine, positive feelings is where God is, and the other things he's not there. And this is obviously, this is idolatry, because God's everywhere and everything. And we have to see him and apply his will in all parts of life. We can't just limit him to certain areas because it feels good. And in fact, the mistake is also that not only that, but actually what God really wants is you to find him and enlighten and reveal him in those places which are very dark. So it's In fact, you can even say that the purpose of last week's portion is for this week's portion. In other words, like usually it's thought of that, well, and in fact, it's not wrong to feel, when do I get back to the synagogue? When can I get back to my studying Torah and get out of like my mundane things I have to do? So that's from the human perspective. But from God's perspective, he wants you to come to spend time with him so that you get the energy and the light and the inspiration to go into the darker places and bring him there, so to speak. So you spend the time studying Torah and praying, and then you have you're uplifted to the extent, where you now can apply those things in those more human arenas of life and darker, more practical areas we don't see God so much. And you bring him to those places too, and you make exactly this statement. This all belongs to him, that the earth is full of his glory. Even in these places, even when you're dealing with, you had someone borrow your stuff and they lost your stuff, or they even lied about your things. They even swore, falsely. And we have to know how to deal with that situation. And that's really is harder, like to go to dark places, to go where people have violated God's will and go there and deal with it. It takes a lot of courage. To be honest with you, I don't really like to go there. I mean, it's not easy, like to visit a prison and deal with people who were murderers or committed armed robbery or who knows what, or mass fraud, and deal with it, or people who are even worse, maybe people who knows what they've done, all kinds of abuse or whatever, and try to connect with them and try to make them a little bit better. It's very hard, very difficult. And sometimes even to deal with people we know that are stuck in things we know are dysfunctional or just morally wrong, and we try to speak to them and you don't see change. It's very demoralizing, And so for those people who can go to those places, which is what a Beis Din is supposed to do, a Beis Din has to deal with these issues and get their hands in. King David, I forget the exact verse, but there's a verse somewhere where he speaks about blood. I forget the verse in which the Talmud extrapolates that King David is talking about the fact that he was on a court and they used to come with him with questions of what is it called? Uteral discharges, because a woman's menstrual discharges, a different type of blood he was examining to figure out if a woman was impure and in what way, and different things. So this is very, it doesn't seem like a very lofty thing to be doing, but yet this is the everyday ABCs of Jewish law applying to everything, even people's private lives. It's also something people don't want to do. Synagogue is one thing. Don't tell me how to behave in my bedroom, right? But so the Jewish people have to, in every situation. There's God's mandates in every place. Of course, we believe that this helps to how do I say, lift up these mundane areas and sanctify them. But anyway, what my point I'm focusing on now is the courage to do this, and the faith a person needs to do this, to bring sanctity into dark places, or even everyday places, and this is a real test, and this is really the mission in Judaism, because I wondered about this when I was younger. I mean, it's so. When is a Jew really, recognized? When they become a couple, when you're still studying and everything. You're young. You're within the community. You're a minor, even if you're an adult. But if you're not, until I mean, I think it's changed a little bit, but to a great extent, until you're married, In Yiddish even, the expression is, there's a difference between a married man and an unmarried man. An unmarried man is called a bacher, a young man, he's a youth. That's a good way of saying it. And a married man is called a younger man, a young man, young gentleman. So there's a different way of describing the person before marriage and after marriage. Once you married, according to Ashkenazi custom, the man wears the talis, the prayer shawl, if not before. And this seems strange because up until a person gets married in Haredi culture and in Orthodox culture in general, so the young man is studying Torah all the time. Once he gets married, so then, once the person becomes married, then he's busy with all these mundane matters. He's got to pay bills. He's got to deal with things his wife wants or needs or something. His marital relations is completely a physical related type thing. So, and there's a day-to-day of managing the relationships between the two of them. So this seems very strange. You're going from a world which is, on the mountaintop, and you're getting into the gritty of the world, and that's when you're starting to live, meaning to say that's when you're a full practicing Jew. Maybe you should never get married. Like, some priests, they don't get married, Catholic priests. They're married, that's it. Because, it's the puritist that you're staying aloof from the world. But that's not what we do. So this is the whole point. So that shows you, and again, it's very counterintuitive. It's not just counterintuitive, it's just really hard. It's just hard. That means you have to take that energy and you have to somehow bring that energy of Torah study and prayer into your life. And you have to make sure you keep yourself restrained but even more than that, like, you have to become a whole person and to be one person here and there. So what's going to happen? Are you going to be affected that your Torah study and your prayer become cold because now you're in this world? So, that stuff was when you were in yeshiva. Now your life has now become making money and, providing the needs of your family, and you forget about your spiritual ambitions and so on, or you bring that energy into your life. And so I'm going to do these things for the sake of heaven. I want to bring God into my home, and that God, when I'm kind to my family, I'm bringing God into my life. So this is what we're looking for. We're looking for bring God into the mundane. We're looking a person should feel that they're God's emissaries, and even that God is their partner in the nitty-gritty of everyday life. And so that's an interesting thing because, on Mount Sinai, God appeared as an awesome, terrifying king, I guess, and lawgiver. And he becomes kind of like a father, holding his children's hand as the father or teacher who's in the room as the kids are playing, because that's what we're doing. We're just playing. We're just fooling around, after 120 years, the actual, issues that came up, it's not going to matter anymore. What's going to matter is, how did we deal with it? Did we follow Torah? Did we not? Did we seek to bring kindness into our workspace? Did we bring Torah into our workspace? Did we make sure just to act in the same way we act in the synagogue, in the workspace? Did we speak kindly to people also in the workspace? Did we make sure to lend people money, not to make a profit and abuse people, but to help people? In a perfect world, and we see this as a very sad thing, but the Torah wants us to lend money to help the poor. But it was even those they needed that to create different type of vehicles, legal vehicles that people could continue to lend money even past the sabbatical year, and even create situations in which people could lend with interest, because it was people were unwilling or it was burdensome to lend to the poor. People were losing money. Of course, in reality, it's not. I mean, I could say this is in an ideal world that the Torah really seems to demand, is that a person should lend money to their fellow without interest and not worry. Of course, the person shouldn't make themselves bankrupt, but the point is, money that they can afford to lend, that taking into consideration the possibility that they may not get a repayment or that they'll be out of their hands for a long period of time, they should do so. They should take the risk. And God will repay them. And that's really the overlap, by the way, of these two Torah readings from last week and this week, is that it's the faith that was developed by this from seeing God in last week's reading, that we need to take that energy in the way we behave in our daily life. In other words, like giving charity or lending money, or how do we speak to the poor and the widow? How do we speak to the convert? When the person's humbled by last week, when they feel they were in the presence of God, when they pray in the morning, they feel like they're in the presence of God, and that God took us out of Egypt, and God provides for all our needs, and they feel humble. And then when they see a stranger, and they say, "Well, we were strangers also," which is exactly what it says this week. Do not oppress the stranger. If you were strangers in the land of Egypt yourselves, don't oppress the convert, right? Don't afflict them. Some translate. Same idea. Don't cause them pain and suffering. Don't cause suffering to the widow and the orphan, in which Rashi comments, by the way, this applies to everybody. Shouldn't cause anybody suffering. It's just that they're so vulnerable that it's most common that people should persecute them because they don't have anyone strong who's standing up for them. So this was in the days before widows were COOs of Fortune 500 companies, maybe, I don't know. But in generally speaking, I guess we're saying that a widow, with an orphan widow at home, she was a homemaker, and now she has lost her wage earner, and she has the orphans at home, and she has to come to, sometimes even God forbid, beg for assistance. These are people that are vulnerable, and I mean, it's actually quite amazing. The severity of the punishment for mistreating them is extremely severe. If you look at chapter 22, verse 22 and 23, in which it says that if you do cause them suffering, to the widow and the orphan, if they cry out to me, I'm going to listen, God says, and I will become angry, and I will slay you by the sword, and then your wives will be widows and your children will be orphans. That's so serious. Obviously, you've all read that, I'm sure. It's nothing new, but it's so intense, and with such a wrath, which is what they call the wrath of the Old Testament, right? But I guess it's it's a zealous, I guess, I think I often call it like I'm looking for the words. The word is like, well, shock is the word that's coming to my mind, but it's not shock. It's what is the word? The word isn't coming to my mind, but something that we absolutely can't tolerate. It's a kind of an anger that comes from something that's intolerable. it shocks the conscience. And that forces us to react in an angry way. And I guess this is a lesson that there are certain types of anger that are good. I mean, if God is telling us he gets angry in this situation, then that's kind of a lesson, isn't it? So lucky we should. We need to be angry when we see injustice. That's the lesson. This is really, I guess, maybe the only place for anger is when we see injustice. Because we need to be, have the impulse to do something about it, do something about it quickly. And that's what this verses are saying, and it's counterintuitive. It just tells you about what kind of society we should want to create. What do we have and what do we need to have? Because usually what we find is that when others are oppressed, we find apathy. Nobody really cares until it touches them somehow. Or if they feel this is going to come home to them soon. All of a sudden, everybody's in an uproar. But when it has to do with someone else far away, nobody cares. And that's wrong. I mean, that's the situation here. God is far away. The widow and the orphan are calling out to him, we spoke about this word before, they're crying out, which is a sign of God's distance. They're crying because he's not close to have. Whisper is when you're close. Crying is when you're far. So they're crying out, and he's responding with, zealous anger pretty quickly, it sounds like. Although it doesn't exactly say, but yeah, he says, I'm going to be angry, and I'm going to exact vengeance quick against them. And by the way, this is another question we may give us an answer on something. If we see a society that's plagued by war, what could their sin be? And I'm not a prophet, and I'm not going to pretend to know, but this portion tells us a lesson. What we need to look for. If we're under attack by the sword and people are lost, maybe we have to take a good look at how we treat the most vulnerable in our society and see how we treated them and the widows and orphans. And that might give us an answer of why it ended up that our people were taken prisoner, et cetera, et cetera. I don't mean to refer to what happened in Israel. But I'm just in general, I would never say that. But the point is that we see this point that we do have to examine this. That basically, I think the point is if a society doesn't take care of the people that are vulnerable, they are going to be susceptible to war. That seems to be the message here.